The question still arises when you look at the proceedings at the Zondo Commission over the last week. Is the Commission fast becoming a battleground, and not just of people testifying, but a battleground within and without? And I say this in relation to the EFF versus Mzwanele versus Pravin Gordhan. And if you saw anything yesterday, Mzwanele Manyi had his own with the evidence leader, Vincent Malega. So what are we to make of this commission, and has it lost its way a little bit? Joining me for this conversation is Dirk Kotzé, who's the professor in political science at UNISA, as well as Kim Heller, who is an independent writer and analyst. For your time, I thank you. Let's begin with what we've seen at the State Capture Commission. When you look at fights that are happening, Prof, outside of the commission, affecting what is happening inside, what are we to make of those fights, and do we expect them to get more as we continue to chase for the truth?
Well, to be quite honest with you, I think what happened outside is side events. It's not the core issue. The core issues are happening inside. And I think we have to understand, in terms of the relative weights, the importance of what happens inside versus what happens outside. I think, to be honest with you, Minister Pravin Gordhan has been sidetracked a little bit by what is happening outside, by now charging the EFF.
I think it was the mentioning of his daughter, Anisha, yes. Or is it Anusha, according to the EFF?
Yes, that is certainly and he complained about it. I mean, he complained about it, that's not about him. He was saying, play me, as the political player, don't play my family. And I think that is part of the complications, and therefore it is very attractive in order to become sidetracked. But I think this is what is very important. And what we also have to take into account, this commission is going to sit for 2 years. This is only the 31st day of the session. So it's, in a sense, still at a very early stage in terms of the commission.
Prof makes a good point, Kim. A good point that the commission will be sitting for 2 years, but therein is the problem also. The commission has a captive audience with captive media. We are there attending, taking pictures and all of that. And it's easy for an entity like the EFF to take advantage of the media that's there, isn't it?
Yes, and I think they're entitled to do that. And I don't think that they are a distraction. I think they are expressing a legitimate voice, and they have the right to do that. I love your view of the commission as a battlefield, and I'm hoping it doesn't deteriorate into a bloodbath, actually, which it may do.
It mimicked one today when you saw Vincent Malega and Mzwanele Manyi. I mean, for me, talk about, battle room activity there. Mzwanele Manyi was not letting up.
But there's an interesting concept. I'd like to take your analogy a little bit further, because the battleground is not necessarily between Manyi versus Williams, or Mentor versus Fana, or Fana, as it may be.
Whichever one it is.
But it actually is it's a battleground, I think, against fact or fiction, truth or propaganda. And Professor Sipho Siepe and I wrote a couple of articles many weeks ago, I think about 6 weeks ago, where we actually cautioned that it looks like the commission could be deteriorating and face a crisis of legitimacy. And it's early days, as you've said, but I think we have to be quite concerned about what we're seeing. And I think I'm less alarmed about the EFF and other bodies being there than what's happening in the ambit of what we call a judicial chamber. We must be careful that it does not deteriorate into a public gallery of opinion, for instance. And what we've seen so far, the media have spoken a lot about this massive, these revelations and bombshells.
Yes.
But we believe, actually, and we've expressed in that article, that the real bombshell is the paucity of evidence. So we're seeing this heap of hearsay. We're seeing what we describe as an avalanche of allegations. And I think that is the greatest threat facing the commission.
Prof, Mzwanele Manyi called the very point that Kim just addressed as, what did he call it? He says that he's not going to prosecute people based on poetry. Look, I think that we're looking for a different kind of evidence when we are looking at a commission. It's different to a court. But don't you think we have enough prima facie evidence for the commission to feel comfortable in the work that is done?
I look at the commission slightly different from those who criticize it at the moment. First of all, we look at who were those who presented themselves to the Commission or provided evidence, mainly from the Treasury and the Ministry of Finance. 2 former ministers, 1 former Deputy Minister, Mcebisi Jonas, 2 former DGs from the Treasury, plus then GCIS. That's sort of the core, plus then the 3 banks. So there's still a very long way to go. I think what they've done is to provide the institutional framework within which many of these things have happened. And because the Treasury was absolutely the key target ultimately for state capture, no one can deny that. You know? Therefore, the Treasury plays such a prominent role in the early stages to set the scene to a large extent. What I think should be understood is that if you want to have concrete evidence, it's going to depend on forensic investigations. It's going to depend on the investigations of things like the police, National Prosecuting Authority, what the media is doing at the moment, not what the ministers or the deputy ministers know. You know, they are not dealing with the nitty-gritty at that level. You know, so the role of the Commission should also not be seen in isolation. The Commission is there. The Nugent Commission is there. The parliamentary portfolio committees that looked at ESCOM and Transnet and others are there. Also the role of the media, in whatever form. In the end, it's the accumulation of all that together that will give us, after 2 years or many more years, actually an understanding of what happened over the past 10 years. So it will be unfair, I would say, inaccurate, to say just concentrate only on the Zondo Commission. Okay,
Kim, Professor makes a very good point. But what we saw was Mzwanele Manyi representing himself, not even led by any council. And essentially, he went there to rebut, not just Phumla Williams, not all the things that were said about him, but that there was no state capture at GCIS, despite what the numbers suggest. Were you surprised?
No, not at all, because I think we have an inclination in this country to work in a paradigm of heroes and villains, and we put somebody like Pravin Gordhan in the heroes category and someone like Mzwanele Manyi in the villain category, so we prejudge him. I found his testimony quite factual. He backed it up with a paper trail, with facts, with numbers.
But he brought in like all kinds of investigations. I mean, for instance, that's not the ambit of what this commission is looking at, but I mean, it was very easy to think that Mzwanele Manyi came there to attack National Treasury, to show that it's also not as clean as it pretends to be.
But he has the right to do that, and perhaps you use the word attack. I don't think so. I think he was one of the witnesses that hasn't reverted to personal attacks or scandalous data. And I don't know that we should discount his facts because it's him saying them, and some of us may not favor him. I think justice can only prevail if it's justice for everybody. Unless, you know, if we have justice selectively, we don't have justice at all. And you know, I find, for instance, everybody was very sympathetic to Williams's testimony, but a lot of her testimony, to me, doesn't even belong in the State of Inquiry Commission, because she speaks about gross human resource violations of issues with her former boss, but she doesn't. She has never sought legal recourse, and she brings human resource matters to this particular commission. And I think so. A lot of what she presented to me was quite invalid and quite personal, where I found Mzwanele was presenting facts and showing his side of the story.
I found Mzwanele Manyi very combative, and I think that he went there with that in mind, that I'm going to disprove, you know, the works of this commission. But my other worry remains about those that have been implicated. I mean, over this week, we heard the Treasury men and one woman line up really to tell us their experience of December 10th, South Africa's day of market and currency infamy, really, when Des van Rooyen took over the portfolio of Minister of Finance. And when I hear those things, Prof, I think Des van Rooyen should want to come and represent himself. But instead, we're seeing Gordhan Mantashe instead. Where are the ANC men and women? When are they lining up to defend themselves?
Well, I think yesterday and the day before was the first time that we've seen at the Commission those who are not, or those who are in a sense implicated, or on the other side, or those who are being accused of being involved with state capture. And Mzwanele Manyi is the first of that. I think that for me, as an outsider, the way in which I interpret it is that he wanted to set a counter-narrative, you know, for what has been presented up to now. So he instead of saying, of trying to attack what has been presented by, let's say, Pravin Gordhan or by Mcebisi Jonas, he said, but this is my side of the story. You know? So in the end, I think it's going to become a bit of a contestation of which narrative is going to become the dominant. Is his counter story plausible? Did you buy it? Well, I'm not going to say now already because it's still, as I said, very early in the stage. You know, and there's going to be others. Even some say even President Zuma will be subpoenaed to come to testify. So there's a lot is still going to happen, and I think the counter argument, the counter narrative, as I call it, is going to be presented in a stronger way. I think what was necessary, what Manyi possibly tried is to say, well, this is going so much in one direction. The other side of the story must now be presented. How many sides are there to state capture exactly? Well, that's the other point of it. You know, I mean, I wrote, for example, a piece in The Conversation which says state capture is not only about the capturing of state institutions by private business, but President Zuma also captured state institutions for his own purposes. So there's many different understandings of what state capture means and the way in which it functioned. The role of SARS, you know, the Nugent Commission is going to, well, I saw they have now an extension of 2 weeks, but is going to present their dimension of it also. And I think over time we will have to be able to put everything together, the books being published, some books that's still in the pipeline, about it, to put it together in order to understand what was the real nature of the past 10 years at least. Kim, you're going to close off here. Okay, my biggest surprise, was the fact that there was no black, yellow and green t-shirt supporting Pravin Gordhan. Contrast that with the ANC members that we saw supporting Jacob Zuma at the Durban High Court. So, were you surprised at the lack of support for Pravin Gordhan? And does the ANC, is it split about this commission? Because you hear members of the ANC speaking against this commission.
Certainly, and I think it's divided, and someone like Pravin Gordhan seems to have a lot of support in mainstream media, but not necessarily on the ground. And I think what we see is indicative of that. And I actually think it was quite mischievous and incorrect of President Ramaphosa this week to ask South Africans to come out in support of him. But aren't you supposed to support your minister, especially when you just accepted a resignation? No, not so, not quite. In the midst of a running commission, I think nobody, including the president, should make that claim. But can I finish off with another point? We must be very careful about how we see state capture. We seem to think it's a preserve of certain people, and that's a story that's being traded in the mainstream media. State capture is treason against the ordinary citizen in this country, and it must be condemned. And anyone guilty of abusing our democracy and public officials who have facilitated those relationships must be condemned and found guilty and face them out of the law. But they must be done on evidence, not on speculation. And I'd like to close off just by reminding ourselves of our history and where we've seen this happening before, and urge that we don't fall into the same trap. President Mbeki faced 16 years of media onslaught and an attack until the Seriti Commission into the arms deal found him guilty, that there was not a body of evidence on which he could be convicted or found culpable. And we must make sure we do not fall victim of this again.
I'm going to give you a closing comment too, Prof. This commission, it's on the back of many other commissions. That ordinary citizens will wonder what happened to them. I mean, you think Farlam, you think TRC, you think all of these commissions. And I don't know, what's the real value?
Commissions don't have a good history. They don't have a good track record. I would say, for example, Parliament or the portfolio committees are actually more effective than commissions of inquiry or judicial commissions. First of all, they take too long. Secondly, they very often don't make recommendations that's very tangible. That's very specific. Very often they refer it to further investigation. So I don't have very high expectations about this commission. I think what is more significant is that the fact that we see every day it on television being broadcast. And in a sense, there's the similarities with the TRC. It's a public process, so there's an inherent element of accountability from whatever side, but that the leaders, the different political leaders have to do towards the public of South Africa.
Dirk Kotzé, Kim Heller, I thank you both for your time. That's where we leave our show this evening. Join us again on Thursday at 6:30 as we continue to look at that intersection between money and power. Until then, good evening.